All right, today we're talking about the smart fix for a billion-dollar business problem. We're going to unpack a really brilliant solution to something that costs big companies an absolute fortune every single year. I'm talking about rigid, inflexible compliance rules. The fix? It's surprisingly elegant. So let's just dive right in.
So it all kicks off with this really simple question, right? Why is following the rules so expensive for big companies? I mean, we all get that companies have to follow rules, but how does it turn into this massive, expensive, time-sucking headache, especially for the really big players out there?
Well, a big part of the answer has to do with regulations like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. You might have heard it called SOX. So after some huge financial scandals, these laws came down and basically forced companies to prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that they had tight control over all their business processes. The goal was to prevent fraud, and look, that's totally non-negotiable. But, and this is the big but, the way companies have traditionally tried to do this has created a whole new, massive problem of its own.
Okay, so let's get right to the root of the problem. It actually has a name: hard-coded compliance. And to really get what that means, we need to take a quick look at how businesses, actually work on the inside.
And to do that, we're going to use a super common classic example, something that happens thousands of times a day in any big company: the purchase-to-pay process. It's pretty much what it sounds like. It's the whole journey of how a company buys something and then, well, pays for it. I mean, on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Someone used to buy something, so they create a purchase request. You select a supplier, you get the purchase order approved, you send it off, and boom, you process the payment. Looks like a nice, clean, standard workflow. But you knew there was a but coming. This is where things start to get really complicated. And here's the problem. Even though the end goal is exactly the same for everyone, just buy the stuff you need, every single company has its own set of very specific internal rules, their own unique way of managing risk and making sure they're staying compliant. Let's make this super concrete. Picture two different companies, Company A and Company B. And let's say they're using the exact same software, okay? Now, Company A is worried about people spending money they shouldn't. So their rule is any purchase order over 5,000 euros has to be double approved. Makes sense. But then you have Company B. They're not worried about that so much. They're worried about their supply chain. So their rule is that no purchase order over 5,000 euros can be approved all at once. See what's happening? It's the same basic process, but their internal rules are polar opposites. And this right here, this is the core of the issue. The research paper we're looking at puts it perfectly. It says this results in two completely different variant types, although from the business objective point of view, these variants are equivalent. What does that mean in plain English? It means both companies just want to buy things, but because of their different rules, their software has to be individually bent and twisted and customized just to make it work for them.
And that is what we mean by hard-coded. These compliance rules, they're not just some checklist that sits on the side. No. They are literally programmed, written directly into the core DNA of the business software. The analogy I love is this. It's like baking the rules right into the cake batter. If you decide you want a little less sugar, well, too bad. You can't just take it out. You have to throw the whole cake away and bake a brand new one from scratch.
So you can see how this old way of doing things is just so rigid. It's ridiculously expensive to change anything, and it makes companies painfully slow to adapt. Think about it. Every single time a regulation changes or the business strategy shifts, you've got to call on the programmers to perform open-heart surgery on the code. There just has to be a better way, right? A way that's flexible, efficient, and, fast. Well, good news, there is. And that brings us to the big idea, the core of this research. I like to think of it as the process and the mirror. So the whole solution is built on this really fundamental principle from computer science. It's called separation of concerns. And it's actually a very simple but incredibly powerful idea. It just means you keep the different parts of a system separate from each other. So for example, you don't wire your car's engine into its sound system. Why? Because you want to be able to change a speaker without accidentally, blowing up the transmission. You keep unrelated things separate. And so when you apply that thinking here, the genius move is to do the exact same thing. Separate the business process, the how we do things, from the compliance controls, the what are the rules. In other words, stop baking the rules into the cake. The fancy name the paper gives this solution is the semantic process mirror. And it's a great name. Just think of it as this intelligent layer that kind of sits on top of the actual business process. It watches everything. It understands everything that's happening, just like a mirror reflecting the action in the room. But, and this is the critical part, it never actually touches the process itself. It's just watching.
So the big question is, how does this mirror actually work? Let's break down this whole approach. It really comes down to 3 phases. Okay, step 1, you build the mirror. This is basically a perfect digital blueprint of your business process. Step 2, you take all your compliance rules, like that double approval over 5,000 euros rule we talked about, and you write them all down in a totally separate formal rulebook. Think of it like a Word doc, super easy to edit. And then step 3, the magic happens. As the business goes about its day, the mirror is just watching every single step, and in real time, it's checking every action against that rulebook. And don't think this is just a passive system. Oh no, this system has teeth. If that mirror sees an action that's about to break a rule, it can instantly trigger something called a recovery action. And this could be anything. It could automatically block the transaction. It could shoot an urgent notification to a manager to take a look. But the key here is that it stops the problem before it becomes a problem, all without ever having to go in and change the original software. And this right here, this is the magic. The researchers themselves say it perfectly in the paper. They say with this, new application controls can be defined on business processes without changing the original business logic of processes. Think about that. You can add new rules, change old rules, do whatever you want, whenever you want, without ever having to call a programmer to mess with the core code. This is an absolute game changer. Okay, so what's the real payoff here? What does this new, more flexible future actually mean for a business? Well, the benefits are just massive. First off, adaptability goes through the roof. I mean, changing a rule is now as simple as editing a document instead of a 6-month coding project. Because of that, your costs just plummet. You're not paying for these insane custom software jobs for every tiny little rule change. And maybe most importantly, the speed. The speed at which a company can now react to new regulations or changes in the market, it's just off the charts. So, if we're going to summarize, the gains are just huge. You've got adaptability, obviously, reusability. You can take the same rule concepts and apply them to all sorts of different processes. Usability is a big one too. Suddenly, the auditors and the tech teams can actually speak the same language, which bridges this massive, frustrating communication gap. And of course, you get automation and massive cost savings. The whole shebang. So what you're left with is this. The semantic process mirror completely transforms compliance. It goes from being this rigid, expensive, static roadblock into a dynamic, intelligent system that actually works with the business instead of constantly fighting against it. And that brings us to one last, really interesting thought to leave you with. If you have this intelligent mirror that can watch any process and check it against any rulebook, what else could you put in that rulebook? Forget financial compliance for a second. What if that mirror could check for, operational efficiency or for fairness in how decisions are made? What if it could be trained to detect and flag potential bias in a process in real time? The possibilities, they are just absolutely fascinating to think about.